This is a demo of the Compellent Storage Center integration for VMware vSphere. As you can see, when we click on plugins, the Compellent integrations are merely a Compellent vSphere client plugin, much like the Host Update plugin. To configure it for the first time, from the home screen we click on the Compellent Storage Center icon, click Add New System, and then enter the IP, username, and password of the storage center that we want to manage. As you'll notice, I've already added two systems in here. Once added, we can click on System Properties to get the general controller health of the system. We can also launch the System Explorer from here for more fine-tuned management. When I click on Storage Summary, I can flip between the two systems. And I can get the statistics of the amount of space left and even basic drive health. Once the systems are defined, we can then go over to the Compellent settings. This will allow me to automatically configure storage center settings for this particular ESX host. For example, when I highlight the iSCSI adapter and highlight SC5, you'll see that it is configurable. If I click on the Configure button, this will automatically configure the iSCSI settings to connect Avalon to Storage Center 5. Once everything's been configured, we can now provision storage. I right-click on Avalon, I say Manage Compellent Storage, and Add Data Store. First, I select the storage center that I want to create this new volume on and say Next. I then can either map up an existing volume or create a new compellent volume. So I want to create a new compellent volume and I say Next. Now I type in the name of the volume, for example, Demo VMFS Data Store. And then I click in the size, per example 750 gigs. Now I select a folder that I want to put this new volume in and say Next. Next I select my storage profile. For example, I want data progression. I can put it to a different profile, a custom profile, or just say recommended and say Next. Next I select my replay profile or the snapshot schedule that I want for snapshots or replays to be taken of this data store. I'll select that and I say Next. Now I'll select the LUN number. If we scroll down here, you'll notice that LUN 10 is missing. That's because LUN 10 is already mapped up to this host. So I will scroll down a little bit more and I will pick LUN 15 instead and I'll say Next. Now I get to pick the protocol. I can use any available iSCSI or even fiber channel and say Next because this is a multi-protocol host. I choose the data store name. As you can see, it's the same from the volume name. I select my block size, for example 4 meg for the data store, and I click Next. And then I verify the settings and click Finish. Right now the plugin is going out to the storage center, provisioning the storage, automatically rescanning the HBA. And if we click on Configuration and Storage, in a second here we're going to see a brand new data store appear. And there it is. One thing you'll notice is this is a 750 gig data store. Let's say I wanted this to be a little bit bigger. I can right click on this and I can say Manage Compellent Storage and I can extend this data store. Type in the new size. Let's say I want to add 100 gigs to it, so 850 gigs, and say Next. And Finish. This is extending it and then automatically rescanning and going into VMware and extending the data store for me automatically. As you can see now, the data store is now 850 gigs. Now let's look at the data store properties. If we highlight this newly created data store, I can see the compellent settings for this particular data store. I can see the usage statistics, how much is in use on it. I can see the connectivity info. I can see the volume replays. Let me highlight a volume and we'll click on volume replays. Here's all the replays that are taking of that volume, and I can even check the volume replications. Now that this data store is ready to be used, I can replicate it. For example, for SRM, right click, say Manage Compellent Storage, and say Replicate Data Store. I select my destination system, for example SC4, and I say next. I then select my QoS definition. Let's say I want to replicate it over iSCSI. I select a folder for the destination volume on the other system, and I say next, and finish. If we open up the tasks, you'll see in just a few seconds this volume is going to be done replicating. Now we can look at the statistics of this data store. Let's click on the data store, compellent storage, and we'll click refresh here and click on the volume replications. And as you can see, this is 100% synced now. Now let's look at some virtual machine tasks. If I highlight the virtual machine, I can check out the storage that's currently used by that virtual machine. If I right click on that virtual machine, I can right click and say manage compellent storage. I can add an RDM. I verify the SCSI device ID and I say next. I can now select the storage center I want to create that new RDM volume on and say next. As you can see, Avalon, the host, is already checked by default. I say next. Now I can map an existing RDM or create a new RDM for this particular virtual machine. I create a new one, type in the name, for example, RDM test VM12. I can also give it a size, for example, 150 gigabytes. And I scroll down and I can put it in a folder and say next. Now I pick my storage profile. I'm going to go with the recommended data progression profile and say next. And check the daily and I select the replay profile I want to apply to this volume and say next. I'm going to select a LUN number and give it 16 and say next. I pick fiber channel and say next. Now I can pick physical mode or virtual mode RDM and say next. And verify the settings and click finish. This is going out, creating the volume, mapping it up, rescan the HBA, and automatically adding it to the virtual machine. Now if I go over to the virtual machine and I right click and I say edit settings, you're going to see that the RDM has been added to it automatically. Say OK. Next, let's show some replays with data stores. If we go over to my data store view, I highlight one of my data stores that has virtual machines on it. I right click, I say manage compellent storage, and I can say create replay. For example, I want to back up this particular data store before I apply my monthly patches. I'll set the expiration maybe 14 days. I'll give it a description, pre-monthly patches. And I say next. Now I can include a VMware snapshot if I wanted to, including memory and quiescing the file system, but in the essence of time, I'm just going to uncheck that and say next. And I verify and say finish. The replay is created almost instantaneously. Now when I go to the Storage Center tab and I click on the replays, I'll give it a quick refresh, and as you can see, my new replay is listed in there. Now let's pretend for a second that my patches went horribly wrong. I can now recover that particular data store, and I click on Recover VM Data. If we look, here's a listing of all the replays I can recover back to. I can check the pre-monthly patches, so I can go back in time to right before I applied the patches. I can even go back several months. I say next. Now I select the host. I want to map up this vVolume 2 and say next. This is the name that it's going to automatically give it. That's the time right now. I can put anything in there. It's just a label, and I say next. I'll then select a LUN number. In this particular instance, I'll give it 17 and say next. Verify that and say finish. This is going out and creating the recovery view volume, mapping it up to the ESX host, rescan the HBAs. It's going to go in there. It's going to automatically resignature that data store. And in a few seconds, we'll have the recovery volume. So I'll expand this so we can look at this. As you'll see, here's the production data store and the recovery data store side by side. So I can do any sort of side-by-side recovery that I need. If I browse this data store and look, there's the files. I can right-click on this test VM1. I can add it to inventory if I want to recover the whole virtual machine. I can right click on a VMDK and move that back to the original data store if I want to recover a full VMDK. I can even attach that VMDK to an existing virtual machine to recover files off of it. Now let's deploy some virtual machines from a gold image I've created using Compellent's dedupe boot. I right click, I say manage compellent storage and say provision virtual machines. I want to expose a VMFS gold image that I previously created, so I say next. I select the storage center that has that template gold image on it and say next. I locate the gold image in my folder structure. There's my 10 virtual machine gold image. I select the replay and say next. Now select the LUN number that I want to assign this new data store, maybe 18, and say next. Now I give it a name. I'll name it cloned data store. This is both the view volume name and the data store name, and I say next and finish. It's now going to go out, create the view volume, rescan the HBA, automatically resignature it for me. In a few short seconds here, I'm going to have a brand new data store with my cloned gold image virtual machines on it. I go back to the data store browser, right click on my clone data store, and let's browse it. As you can see, I have 10 virtual machine templates that I can now deploy. Let's deploy one. Let's rename the folder first. We're going to call this web server 1. Let me hit refresh. Now I can go into that folder. I'll right click on the VMX file. I'm going to say add to inventory. I type in the name. I select the data center. I say next. Select the host I want that virtual machine to run on. I say next and finish. And now I can flip over to the inventory tab to look at that virtual machine. Highlight that virtual machine. Let's open up the console and power it on. First prompt is copied it. I'll say OK. That will regenerate the EUID because we know that this virtual machine is cloned. The virtual machine now is going to go through the sysprep process. It's going to go through the mini setup wizard. It's going to follow the sysprep INF that I had specified for it. It's going to automatically configure it in a few short seconds. We're going to have a virtual machine that's booted, fully configured, and usually when it gets up to this point, all I need to do is log into the virtual machine, maybe change a couple settings, install some apps, and it's all ready and it's been deployed. One more thing I want to point out is that if we look at the data store browser with the dedupe boot, the great thing is that these other 9 templates, because we only store data as it's written, these are consuming no space. So they basically aren't consuming any space until I go in, power them on for the first time. And that concludes this demo. Thanks for watching.